All right, welcome back. I'm excited to introduce our next speaker, Stacy Smedley. She's the Executive Director at Building Transparency. Please join me in welcoming Stacy to our virtual stage.
Thanks so much. I'm happy to be here and be sharing with you today. I'm going to go ahead and jump right into my presentation. Today I'll be talking about what I call moving at the speed of collective impact by reducing the embodied carbon of what we build. Today I'm wearing my executive director hat, literally and figuratively, of Building Transparency, which is a new nonprofit aimed at actually reducing the carbon emissions of construction materials through providing free and open access tools and data. I always like to start with just grounding everyone in the impacts of the building industry, and this is looking at it through the lens explicitly of carbon emissions. We now know that over the next 30 years, we're building about 2 trillion square feet of construction globally. That's the equivalent of an entire New York City every 35 days for the next 35 years. If you try to imagine what that actually looks like in terms of building stock and all of the materials that we are having to manufacture and install to build that much, and then all the energy we're taking to operate all those buildings. It is a lot, and it's something that if we're trying to get to zero carbon emissions by 2050, if not sooner, to mitigate the impacts of climate change, we have to understand buildings' role in that and work actionably to reduce the carbon. The other thing that we've learned over the past handful of years is that there really are these two buckets of carbon emissions when it comes to buildings. There's the operational carbon emissions, which are, of course, the emissions associated with all of the energy that we consume in buildings once they're constructed. That's what we've typically been thinking about when we've talked about zero carbon or net zero energy for buildings. But there's this other bucket of carbon that we call embodied carbon. It's the carbon emissions associated with the extraction, the manufacturing, the transport, the installation, the replacement cycle, and then the end of life of the materials that we build with. And what we're finding now based on data is that embodied carbon can be upwards of 50%, if not more, of the carbon emissions associated with buildings to 2050. So once you've emitted all of the carbon to make the materials and put them into place, it's there. The operational carbon, the operational energy actually, of course, always is increasing over time of the building's use. So now that we know this, we really need to be thinking about what to do about it. This is just another example of the data we're now able to pull. This is from Fortune. It's showing us really in terms of carbon emissions where they are. And we think normally about building carbon emissions as about 40% of the pie when it comes to operational energy. But what we now know is that the energy and the manufacturing emissions that we use to make materials can actually have a large impact, like I mentioned, and that things like cement and steel are some of the largest industrial emissions, which are, of course, things that we build buildings out of. So again, how do we start to look at these emissions and actually reduce them like we have been on the operational side for some time? But what Building Transparency is trying to do through this new tool called EC3, or the Embodied Carbon and Construction Calculator, is really to kind of fill a gap that exists in the building industry when it comes to how we can account for these carbon emissions of materials. There are tools that the industry has used for some time now when it comes to looking at life cycle assessment of materials and using average data to try to figure out, should I build my building out of this or that? That's starting to get adopted. But there wasn't really a tool or a way for someone to actually say, I know I'm using concrete or cement. I know I'm using steel. I know I have this much carpet in my building. How do I procure the lowest carbon option when it comes to my material choice and look at the cost and carbon together? So that's really what the EC3 tool is trying to do. So EC3 is a free, open access, transparent, as easy to use as possible tool that's been industry-led and supply chain focused. This is the mandate that the tool was set up to actually achieve when it was co-conceived. The tool has been informed by industry, as I mentioned. It started out as a concept that was created by Skanska and myself and SeaChange Labs, a tool developer. We then showed it to Microsoft, who was building a large campus, and agreed to pilot and seed fund the idea. And it was then incubated at the Carbon Leadership Forum at the University of Washington as a project to really engage as much of the industry as we could to support and inform what a low carbon procurement tool could look like. Once it was launched publicly in November of 2019, Building Transparency, a new nonprofit, was set up to continue to scale the tool. and also to look at other open access data and tools that might be necessary to really create a movement and enable swift action around embodied carbon. Current funders this year are listed on the screen. So these are the partners that we have at Building Transparency, continuing to inform and pilot the tool. This is an ongoing and constantly growing and changing list of who's engaged. Pilot partnership means that you're actually testing the tool and how it works and getting access to new features as they develop. Building Transparency's mission, as I mentioned, was really to look at how we can manage and scale the EC3 tool, but also how does the ecosystem, what does it need to really support open access tools and data? So I won't go into detail on this, but beyond what we're doing with EC3, we're also working on projects around digitization and standardization of EPDs, which I'll talk about a little bit more in detail, but also other open access databases that can be either digital and called through APIs into other tools. And then we're also working on advocacy groups that bring together folks in the AEC industry, whether it be manufacturers through Materials Can or owners through Owners Can, to start to develop educational resources and aligned language around how we look at embodied carbon emissions in the building industry. To dig in a little bit to EC3, which I'll focus on for the rest of the presentation, really what it's doing is trying to approach carbon emissions of materials like we've approached cost for a long time, where we create cost estimates at various stages of the design and construction process by using a cost per unit of material. So what EC3 does is take material quantities from construction estimates or BIM products like Autodesk BIM 360 or Revit, and then multiplies those quantities by the carbon impacts of the manufacturing emissions of materials. So we could do a kilogram of carbon per unit, just like we do a cost per unit. And that will give you both an upfront estimate for a project to be able to set targets, understand potential carbon emission impacts from your building materials, as well as start to find and compare materials to inform specification and procurement. The tool's database relies on third-party verified environmental product declarations, or EPDs, and they're really like a nutrition label for a building material, where you've got a declared unit or a serving size, and then a kilogram of CO2 equivalent per unit, similar to a carbohydrate on a label for a food item. These have typically been PDF documents that are verified by program operators and published. And what we've done is actually created machine scripts that will read those PDFs and turn them into digital objects to allow the carbon information, as well as things like plant location, to be searched and queried in a database. Like I mentioned, we get the actual quantities from either construction estimates from contractors or direct imports or exports from BIM softwares, including an integration with a lifecycle assessment tool called Tally, where a user could actually go in and do that early lifecycle assessment with their project and then export their quantities into the EC3 tool. And I really do feel like we're at a tipping point when it comes to embodied carbon, that we're reaching a point where we're seeing some positive impacts that have no return, that they're going to keep on going and growing to help counteract the negative ones of climate change. Just a couple of ways that we're seeing this in terms of a tipping point. This is the first slide. Actually, this is out of date. We're actually over 12,000 users now of EC3, but this is just the curve I don't want to flatten since its launch in 2019. And the breakdown of who's using the tool. So you can see that we wanted it to be industry-led and focused. And by doing that, we had users that kind of go across the architecture, engineering, and construction communities, as well as getting into sustainability consulting, owners, and manufacturing. So a really diverse group of users looking at the tool. What the tool does, again, is leverage a database of these EPDs by material category with a real-time graph and kind of database of how many EPDs we have in the tool. And we've seen that grow substantially also over time. So this is just a kind of a snapshot of the different materials in the tool from an EPD perspective and how the database is continuing to grow. The other important part, I think, is that we're starting to see the number of searches and comparisons being done within the tool and the categories climb drastically, with over 50,000 almost 50,000 searches of the concrete category in its first year of function. With that, I'm going to just dig into a very brief demo so you can see the tool in action and see how to sign up. The tool lives at buildingtransparency.org. So if you go to the website, you'll see the ability to register for free. Once you've registered, you can actually sign in. And I will sign into my admin account just so you can see all the features. You're going to see on the landing page that, as I mentioned, the first thing it's going to show you is an actual snapshot of how many EPDs we have and where we have them from. We started as a North American database, so that's where we have the most. We are now quickly populating the database with environmental product declarations from around the globe. On the concrete side, we currently have a digital integration with the concrete program operators and verifiers that actually create digital versions of mix-specific EPDs as a concrete supplier is making them and translates it into the tool automatically. So you can see that we are a great deal ahead when it comes to concrete EPDs here in the States. So I'll also show you the data in different ways. So you can see just based on concretes versus non-concretes, so are we starting to see deep adoption from suppliers across the U.S., as well as then see a real live snapshot of how many mix or product specific EPDs we have for all of our categories in the tool, all the way to how many actual plants and manufacturers these EPDs equal for each category. So that's really just to kind of show you the live database of EPDs. A couple of things to note is that there's the ability for you to really manage your user type and profile in the tool. You will always start as a private user. If you input your profession and organization, we can give you professional access, which allows you to do things like create user groups and share emails for shared buildings and things like that. So it is good to go into your user profile and set it up to indicate your profession and your organization. Over on the left, I'll just do one or two things just to show you how the tool works quickly in our amount of time that we have today. The first is just to dig into one of these material categories to show you how you can search it. So you'll see on the left over here, you can open these up and just see the different subcategories. I'm just going to click on Ready Mix. You're going to see it's also going to open up in this tree. So if you like the tree view better, you can actually do this kind of searching from the tree. Once you click on the material subcategory that you'd like to search, you can actually go down and click Next. It's going to open up the performance filters for that particular material. You can see this is very specific to concrete, ready-mix concrete, things like compressive strength and other things you could fill in. You can leave the search as broad or as finite as you like. For this, I'm just going to go ahead and just put in a compressive strength that's an exact spec match. So there's my equals 5,000 PSI, which is kind of a typical concrete strength. I'm going to pretend that I'm looking for suppliers in Washington. That's where I'm sitting right now. So I filtered by geography and also by concrete strength. If I click search, it's actually going to query the database and return all of the results that meet my criteria. So if I scroll down, you're going to see these are all my search chips. Washington, valid after today. I'm including both product and industry EPDs with that strength. It's telling me I have over 400 EPDs that meet my criteria. It's going to give me some kilogram of CO2 per unit data by querying all 408 EPDs and pulling those numbers out and doing the averages and the math. And then down here, it's going to show me every single one of these lines is a digitized EPD. So it's telling me the category, the manufacturer, the plant location, the mix product description, and then the strength, as well as the kilogram of carbon per unit of material. This allows you to do a whole bunch of things. One of the most powerful things in the tool is the ability to compare. So if I click compare above the manufacturer, you'll see that I've got my list of EPDs from Cadman, Cal Portland, and Stoneway here in Washington, how many EPDs they have for 5,000 PSI concrete, and then these box plots are giving you their complete range. What you're going to see in these little green sections is us taking the 80th to the 20th percentile. If you hover over, it's going to give you the tool tips. What this means is that we're saying that the crux of the EPDs, 60% are in these green ranges. So directionally, you can start to see how suppliers are performing across their product lines or their mixes, depending on your searches. It also does it for the whole category. So if you're trying to figure out a way in specs or procurement to set limits or targets, you may say I can require EPDs because I have all three of my suppliers that have them. I can also set a limit potentially or reduction targets, or just quite frankly, make them compete at time of bid, which I'll show you in a minute. You can also dig into the documents where you can open up these EPDs and see the digital version. They each have a URL code that you could share that's always distinct to this particular EPD. There's also a QR code, and then there's all of the information about that EPD that we are able to pull out and digitize. The last thing I'll show you before I just jump back to a few slides is how this can apply to a building. So if I go to plan and compare buildings, I can actually open up a building that's a pretty simple one in my list. And show you that here's the name of the building. This is a building that my son Jackson made for our dog Chuck for an underground lair when he was at homeschool. So I gave him a list of materials and told him to build a project. If I go down, you can see that you can do things like classify what level of design, what you're including, where you got your data from, things like that. And then down here, you can see that I've put in, or Jackson actually put in, the description of the material, the quantity of material, and then did that search collection directly from the tool, where he specified the strength. He asked for the EPD's return to be within 100 miles of his project site, because concrete's a local material. And then what he did was actually do the search. And I told him what actual mix to use. So if you were going through procurement and you wanted to realize your savings based on what you procured, you could actually, if you knew the mix ID, find that EPD and select it for that actual material quantity that you input into the tool. What that's going to do is save up to the project level, where you can do a whole bunch of things in terms of summary charts. You can look at a Sankey diagram that's going to show you the relative impacts of the different materials based on carbon. So this is quantity of material times unit of carbon for your particular project and your search. This is saying that if you didn't do anything in terms of low carbon procurement, you could be as high as this conservative number, but there is this range of reduction possible based on available data in the tool today from suppliers at the product level. That rolls up all the way to a building level estimate and the potential to set a reasonable target in terms of a achievable reduction based on the data. You can see it's also giving you the selected line, since I had Jackson also pick the EPDs that were used for the different components. This is telling you that we actually achieved a selected reduction of 26%. There are other diagrams in the database that map to things like LEED, where you can start to look at it this way in terms of a baseline versus what was achievable and what you realized on your project. So if I go back to my PowerPoint, just to kind of put this into a process, what we're seeing the AEC industry do now is really go through these list of steps. The first is, if a manufacturer or product doesn't have an EPD, simply ask for one. We've got template language under the resources tab on our website at Building Transparency that gives you some EPD request letter language that you could actually formalize for your project and give to your suppliers to request EPDs. The second one is, if a manufacturer or product does have an EPD, specify them. Understand if you have multiple options, so you can do a basis of design spec, potentially set limits, reference the EC3 tool if you want to, and really drive that into the specifications that the contractors will use to bid. And of course, the next step is then getting it into the bid documents. We also have some template language on the website for bid document language and how you can start to build this into your bids, even just from an ask perspective. When it comes to concrete, sometimes just the ask can make them compete on carbon and cost. This is an example of how this looks on a bid leveling sheet for concrete, where we've given them the performance of the mixes, we've asked for EPDs, and we're able to, again, show the reductions in the kilograms of carbon per unit of concrete right next to cost, so the owner can make an informed choice. And then, of course, the last thing is to actually track your savings, which is what EC3 allows you to do at that project level, where an owner can set a benchmark or a target at the beginning, actually see that realized through procurement by the actual products they procured and the EPDs they selected. There's just, again, the diagram that shows that for the LEED credit. Just the last thing is that we are seeing major corporations include this carbon in their actual accounting methodologies and commitments. So companies like Amazon and Microsoft have realized their supply chain carbon, which includes what they build, is the largest source of carbon emissions for them. And they're setting zero carbon targets, including the supply chain. So this becomes something that they must track and they must work to reduce using the tools that we put in place. We're also seeing this at the policy level. So this is coming up in policies all the way from counties to federal. Here's an example of a county policy that's requiring EPDs for concrete, all the way up to the federal policy in the US Clean Future Act, which is asking for a national EPD database to be able to set thresholds and reduction targets and getting to an actual climate star for the lowest 20% of, or 10% of products in a category. So really, there's just trends that are happening now. Again, those 4 steps are requiring EPDs, utilizing a database, hopefully a free one like EC3 to display the compliant EPDs that meet your requirements, setting those targets or limits for a specific list of construction materials, and then requiring project teams to submit the data at time of submittal and bid to really realize the savings at the end of the day. And with that, here's my email address. And again, if you would like to register for the tool yourself, you can go to buildingtransparency.org to gain access and start looking at this information for your own function or use. And please reach out to me if you have any questions, you'd like a proper demo, or if we could help really implement this into your processes. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Stacy. If you could stop sharing your screen so the audience can give you a huge virtual round of applause. Great. Thank you so much for sharing these insights with us. I know the audience really enjoyed it. All right, for everyone that's watching, it's time for you to make your way to your next session. Along the way, make sure you accept your connection request and check out our amazing AI exhibits. Thanks so much, and we'll see you around.